So now, ladies and gentlemen, live and in colour, it's Mr. Wayne Lovejuice.
The other day I produced a Louis, had a chat with an interesting chappie who said that the YouTube algorithms really aren't that happy. If a channel only broadcasts once a week, so we decided we could text ya whenever we've got a piece of news in our new book On the Track Xtra. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got two old friends come to visit us in the studio today. It's Cara and it's Ralph the Monster. What are you here to do today, Cara and Ralph the Monster?
So Ralph, what's coming up? Book review.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you may ask why Richard Freeman and I are doing so many book reviews. It's because it's something we always do when we get together, because we're both very, very strong bibliophiles, and my house is only held up by the piles of books everywhere. And Graham is at the moment somewhere over the herring pond. Last time I heard, he'd just landed in Arizona. And he's going to be away in the colonies for the next month. And so Richard Freeman is looking after me. And so, as already mentioned, as Richard and I always do book reviews whenever we're together, here's a book review. Richard, what do we have in this week's episode?
It's Charles Gould's book, Mythical Monsters.
Tell me.
This book was written 25 years after Darwin's Origin of Species in 1886. And Charles Gould was an Australian naturalist, and his father was a famous illustrator of birds, a very, very famous bird illustrator. Now, this book, I first got it as a reprint in the 1980s, because obviously the original will go for quite a pretty penny, but it's been reprinted several times, and it's a hefty book, over 400 pages. Now, his ideas were that a lot of legendary creatures and a lot of the legendary events were based on real things. So he has chapters on a sort of international idea that there was a great flood. You know, most people are familiar with the biblical flood, but all sorts of cultures have this idea of a great deluge at some point, and there's archaeological and paleontological evidence for this. In fact, in North America there were several great floods when glaciers gave way at the end of the Ice Age. They'd formed a sort of barrier, and the water behind them, the ice behind them had melted, and there was ice forming a if you like, a wall, which finally gave way like a dam failing and causing these enormous series of floods. But floods and great storms all over the world, and he has a chapter on that which is really interesting, and the antiquity of man, because when this book was written we didn't know just how old mankind and man's ancestors and relatives were, because paleontology was in its infancy. And then we have chapters on mythical monsters themselves. I mean, they should really be called legendary monsters, because the creatures in here are legendary, not mythical. There's a difference between the two.
Richard, forgive me for interrupting, but what's the difference between something being mythical and something being legendary?
Myths are not based on fact, they're purely allegorical, whereas legends are based on something real. There's a kernel of truth in them, however distorted in the retelling.
So, when you say this book should really be called Legendary Monsters, it's because the things that he's talking about are distortions of the original truth.
Yes, or you could say they're based on something that had some kind of reality to them.
Whereas a myth is something that's allegorical and meant to teach you a lesson.
Yes. And then there's a chapter on dragons in antiquity and in Europe, then the Chinese dragon and the Japanese dragon, the sea serpent, the unicorn and the Chinese phoenix. And with the dragon, he looks at tales of gigantic snakes that are far, far bigger than anything known to science, both in antiquity and contemporary with when this book was written. And he thinks that these are responsible for some dragon legends. But then he theorises this hypothetical species of gigantic monitor lizard that he said would have been related to Megalania prisca, or Varanus priscus as it's now known. I do believe that Megalania is still the popular common name for it. He postulated that Megalania, which was this 25-30 foot long monitor lizard from the Pleistocene of Australia, it had an Asian relative that lived much more recently. And this creature lived on mainland Asia, and it was around well into historical times, and it was carnivorous with huge teeth and claws, heavily armoured, but unlike Megalania, it had wing-like fins running along the sides of its body, a bit like the agamid lizard Heuvelmans, the flying dragon. But it used these things for display, and they would have looked like wings. That's his theory on the dragon, both in Western and Eastern antiquity. Then he looks at the sea serpent, and he covers lots of famous cases, like the case of the Pauline sea serpent, where the crew of the ship the Pauline saw one of these things coiled around a whale, biting into the whale. And there are lots of the classic Victorian sea serpent sightings in here, and pre-Victorian. The Hans Edegay one is covered, and he concludes that these are huge marine reptiles. Then with the unicorn, he looks, but again, both at the western and the eastern unicorn, or the Carin, and concludes that it was based on some sort of antelope, some sort of single-horned antelope. And there is, from the fossil record, we know there was a species that was related to the chamois, called Procamptocerus, that in life its horns were not projecting backwards but projecting forwards on its head, and they were so close together that they would have been covered with one sheath, in effect giving it one horn, which may have been the original unicorn. And finally he looks at the Chinese phoenix, which, unlike the Middle Eastern phoenix, is not associated with fire. And this may well have been a garbled recollection of the Mongolian ostrich, because there used to be ostriches on Mongolia in the Pleistocene, and just when they became extinct, no one's really sure, but their eggs turn up, rather like the eggs of the Madagascar elephant bird turn up. The eggs of the Mongolian ostrich turn up, and no one really quite knows how long they lingered into recorded history. But he thinks that the Mongolian ostrich may be the creature behind the Chinese phoenix, or possibly some bizarre large form of pheasant that's unknown to science. But it's a great book. You can pick it up for a song on eBay or Amazon, because it's been reprinted a number of times, and it is really worth getting hold of.
Now, don't say we never give you anything, because when I was looking for illustrations for this book review, I found that Mythical Monsters is available for free to download from Project Gutenberg Project Gutenberg is an amazing resource for getting hold of stuff that otherwise you'd never be able to read. So I would seriously suggest you pop along there and, using the link that's in the show notes below, get yourself a copy. So I suppose, Richard, this is actually one of the first modern books on cryptozoology.
Yes, it predates stuff like Willy Ley by donkey's years.
Willy Ley wasn't until the 30s and 40s, was he?
No, it wasn't, yeah.
So this is 50, 60 years prior to the people who immediately influenced Heuvelmans.
Yeah, I suppose, apart from the medieval bestiaries, you could say it was the first book on cryptozoology.
Well, it is the first one that treats these things as real animals or distorted tales of real animals, rather than being something which treats them all as horrific creatures of the unknown from the depths of man's imagination, or worse, because they are demonic entities or something.
Well, the medieval bestiaries looked on these as real animals, and they appeared alongside real animals like elephants and lions and crocodiles and things like that. But rather than books on natural history, even though they took them to be real animals, all the animals in the bestiary were in there as instructions for Christians, as allegories. Like the dragon was supposed to be Satan and the Lord of Pride, for example.
That's interesting. Is that where the idea of the lion as the king of beasts comes from?
Quite possibly, yes.
I'd never thought of it like that. So this is the first book that actually brings up the concept that Heuvelmans made his own, the idea of creatures being ethno-known, that there were creatures that were known to the people in the area, who lived in the area, but not to those of us supposedly civilized in the West.
Yeah, and time as well, in the past. Creatures known to people in the past that are now thought of as being purely legendary.